Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Friedman, Senior Climate Reporter with Axios. I want to welcome you to our Axios house here in Dubai in this setting, which I saw renderings of before but didn't quite believe, and now I believe it. Right now, we're going to begin our programming portion of the night. It's focused on the ways to achieve a low-carbon future through collaboration. We have exciting, smart guests who will be up here. But first, a brief segment with our sponsors.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator and Axios publisher, Nicholas Johnston.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. This is day number 2 of Axios House here at COP, our first visit to COP. We're super excited to be here, and we're extremely grateful for the folks who make it happen. We couldn't do anything at Axios without the support of our partners. And so a huge, huge thanks to NextEra Energy Resources for making today possible. And I'd like to welcome to the stage for a View from the Top segment, NextEra's President and Chief Executive Officer, Rebecca Kayava. Rebecca, welcome to Axios House. You lucked out with a seat in the shade, but this will be a nice little winter tan for me. Let's start big picture. As a major energy company that's investing a lot in clean energy, give us your perspective on the progress that the clean energy transition is having.
Listen, it's a tale of two cities, right? And I think we all know that in coming here to COP, especially those of us who are clearly bought in on what needs to happen in terms of the energy transition. But you clearly can't ignore the global stocktake. And it does not appear that we are on track in order to meet our goals. On the ground, though, in terms of what I see in the US, both in the power sector and with our commercial customers, we see everybody trying to do everything that they can. So we have had significant renewables deployment over the last decade or two. We've seen costs come down in that process. So now that we have renewables, it's the least cost form of generation in the US. It's a terrifically positive time in order to see continued progress.
So it's making progress, but I think there's a hint in there that should be faster progress. So let's talk about what needs to happen to make that faster.
You know, it always needs to be faster. I'm one of those impatient people, and clearly when you look at the data, it's a sign that we really should be impatient. For us, the big opportunity is to continue to deploy renewables in the electricity sector. When you look at where we've actually made progress in reducing emissions, whether it's in the US or around the world, it is pretty much only in the electricity sector. So we've reduced the use of coal generation, we've increased the use of combined cycle natural gas plants, and we've deployed a lot of renewables. We can keep making progress on the renewable sector. We only have 15% penetration today. We can go all the way up to 100%. It just takes some time.
But I'm always fascinated by talking with folks who operate utilities, because there's a number of different competing elements here where it's, you know, when the light flip is switched, the lights have to come on. So there are regulators, there's security, there's affordability, there's reliability. Tell me how you think about balancing all of those as part of the transition.
You know, it's been a terrifically interesting time to be in this industry for exactly the points you just made. Reliability, the security of our energy supply, being able to live our lives the way we want to live it. You know, unfortunately, one of the things that was top of mind to us in the middle of COVID is how core to society electricity actually is. So we need to make sure that we can power our customers exactly when they need it. So that's one of the reasons why we are a believer in all of the above. There's not a single technology on which we can rely. We do need wind, we need solar, we need battery storage. Over the long term, in order to really make a difference in hard to decarbonize sector, we need additional alternatives, something like green hydrogen or other technologies in order to really realize the progress we need to achieve.
Let's come back to that technology mix in a second. I do want to touch a little bit on how U.S. policy is affecting that. I mean, what do you think the U.S. government is doing right? What should they be doing more of? Give me some thoughts on that.
We were thrilled with the IRA, not just because of the extension of the incentives, but for the long-term visibility that these incentives now provide. You know, in the history of the renewable sector in the U.S., we've had a boom and bust cycle of the tax credits. Favorable in that they kept getting extended, but challenging in the sense that if you didn't have long-term visibility and you're someone in the supply chain needing to make big capital investments in manufacturing, you didn't have the confidence that you now can have that renewables will continue to be a huge part of the growth opportunity in the electricity sector. So that long-term visibility is a real game changer.
But that is looking at what has happened, what can happen next, what needs to follow on that? I mean, it's not the job being done, but just the passage of the IRA.
And the IRA had so many complexities to it that there's a lot of guidance that needs to come out to interpret what that law means. And that's whether you're talking about the hydrogen production tax credit or certain domestic content incentives that haven't been finalized and other guidance that is still in process. But all of those guidances that still haven't been finalized really could still make a big difference. Hydrogen really could be spurred by having it as low cost as possible so that we can really get up the experience curve and help to deploy that technology. We also would love to see the incentives be very clear on helping domestic manufacturers build new facilities, be able to bring more of the supply chain closer to the US.
So there's a big implementation angle here that you're still very much paying attention to. Do you feel optimistic that that momentum is still sticking with it?
Absolutely. When you think about our last couple of years of origination, we think in terms of contracts with our customers that enable us to build new renewables. We've had the best 2 years of new origination opportunities. We now have a pipeline of 21 gigawatts, which is a very significant amount of new renewables generation just in our backlog, and that contributes a lot of visibility to the up to 40 gigawatts we want to build between now and 2026.
You mentioned some of the technological innovations that are being fed by the IRA. You mentioned wind, hydrogen. What else are you excited of? What do you think are really at the vanguard of accelerating this transition?
Continued deployment of renewables is first and foremost. As we get to higher and higher concentration, storage becomes critically important. And so we are watching all of the battery storage technologies, whether they're 2-hour batteries, 4-hour, or more longer duration forms of storage, such as 8 hours, or as you're starting to get into hydrogen, where it's essentially a different type of storage. The other thing that's really important to see is not necessarily an innovation, but a critical enabler, which is the build out of the transmission grid. We have a transmission grid that was designed to take very large power stations and connect that power to where the customers need to be served. And now we're going to have very distributed forms of renewable energy that need to be connected in new ways.
So this isn't something you do on your own. Who do you view as the best collaborators, the best partners in that transition from the more historical way of generating and providing electricity to what may be more reliant on batteries or renewables forms, which are maybe not somewhat less consistent?
Yeah, we think of needing a lot of partners. I think of partners being critical in the power sector, where we can partner with our customers long term to help them build the generation that they need. We also partner with commercial customers to help them figure out how they can decarbonize and lower their energy costs. And now with the change that we've seen over the last couple of years and the growth in the business opportunities that we see, we're getting far more integrated in our supply chains, not just domestically, but abroad as well, in order to diversify them and in order to make sure that we get the volume of supply that we really need.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned customers there. It's almost making them a part of that process instead of just being passive receivers of electricity, involving them in the generation and the storage and the provision of that.
Absolutely. And when you think about customers and achieving their decarbonization objectives, the first 15% that we've actually achieved is probably the easiest part. And as you get further down your decarbonization path, the challenges become a little more complicated. They get deeper ingrained in people's operations, and it takes knowledgeable partners that have a lot of experience that care about their businesses to really enable solutions that make sense for them, that don't cost too much, enable them to remain competitive in their own industries.
So before we run out of time here, let's take a step back. Let's talk about why we're here in this beautiful space for these 2 weeks. What do you hope to see come out of COP28? What are the tangible results that we can look for next week that you think will be very positive?
I think the key word in your question was tangible. We come here, we talk, we all get aligned on our passion for solving the problem, but we all need real action in the day-to-day, in the moments between COPs, in the decades between COPs. And so I want to see real action. What does that mean? It means continued partnership with customers to actually deploy the solutions that will result in decarbonization. It means engaging in extensive conversations with our suppliers, our industry partners, to bring real projects to fruition. It also, in some cases, especially in areas where the solutions are still higher cost than alternatives that are higher in carbon intensity, Government policy and consistency, especially on a worldwide stage, is incredibly important. I participated in the ministerial session on hydrogen today, was proud to support some of the alignment across many countries as to what does it mean to have a clean hydrogen, and specifically green hydrogen. Those type of partnerships, both across countries and across public and private stakeholders, is incredibly impactful.
All right, excellent. We have a list of things to pay attention to for the next 10 days or so. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here today, and a huge thanks to NextEra Energy Resources for helping make today possible.
Thank you.
And now it's me, the host and editor of One Big Thing, Nyla Boodoo. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our second day at Axios House. I keep telling everyone, thank you for leaving the blue zone to come be with us. Our next guest is Mark Kember. He's Executive Director of VCMI. Mark, welcome to Axios House. Thank you so much for being with us. So we had a big day yesterday, especially for you. Can we just start? Can I just have you both catch us up on the developments yesterday as well as your reaction to them?
Yes, of course. So I work in an organization in voluntary carbon markets. And as many of you will know, the last year has been a tricky year for voluntary carbon markets. There's a lot of scrutiny of projects and a lot of scrutiny of companies and the claims they make about their use of carbon credits. And one of the challenges has been a perceived fragmentation, that some standards are saying one thing, others are saying another. Yesterday morning, the 4 big organizations setting out how corporates should take action on climate change came together, agreed to work on an end-to-end integrity framework, starting with how you count and account for your emissions, how you set targets, how you use carbon credits as part of that net zero transition, and then what kind of credits you can use. And this is something the corporate world has been crying out for. There's work to be done, but the framework's in place.
You said in the lead up to COP that one of your hopes for this year was that the Global South is empowered to participate in high integrity VCMs that are supporting their net zero strategy. How have those conversations gone so far?
This COP has been a real turning point on that. I think many governments in the Global South were concerned that perhaps they were going to be exploited, or that they weren't getting a real say in the governance of the system. And that's really changed. I was at an event with a range of governments, including Kenya and Ghana, who are saying voluntary carbon markets, carbon finance more generally, are central to achieving our climate targets and setting more ambitious targets in the moment. Because one of the biggest barriers, as I think we all know, to climate action is getting finance where it's needed most.
So where do you think the challenges remain, particularly when it comes to the Global South? Is it solely around the financing and how,
It's partly the financing, but it's having countries having strategies that show how carbon finance can leverage other sources of finance. For example, we've seen 2 initiatives this week, the Energy Transition Accelerator, which will help countries wean themselves off coal, and the LEAF Coalition announcing its first contracts for forest protection at a jurisdictional scale. And they work because governments from the Global South are not just recipients, but they're engaged, and they need to be even more engaged in defining what they need, how they need it, how the benefits, the proceeds need to be shared with them, but also with the communities hosting the projects. And that last point is absolutely key. Without the integrity, the host country communities, whether they be indigenous peoples or other local communities, are involved in projects cannot be sustainable. Sustainable in the sense of environmental and social, but sustainable in terms of lasting and having those benefits and continuing to generate benefits through time.
Obviously, as you've said, the integrity of that is so important. You also started this conversation acknowledging how much carbon credit markets have been criticized, right? It's been a really tough year. There's been no shortage of reports showing the number of projects that weren't accomplished, what people promised they would do. Maybe we should just back up, and can I just ask you, why you think we need a carbon market solution in the first place?
Well, we need a carbon market solution because despite the fact that we have been negotiating climate policies internationally since 1988, that's 35 years, we still don't have policies that cover the whole economy in every country in the world, with some very large, important economies that still don't have economy-wide policies. So while we need to push for more regulation and more policy, and that gives companies the certainty they need, we can't wait. There's a big financing gap. We know that we need a multiple of 5 of the current climate finance by 2030. And there are important opportunities to reduce and remove emissions that are available now. There are communities that need it in the global south that need electricity. And they're faced with a choice. Do I buy a diesel genset or do I have solar? And the solar's a bit more expensive. The carbon finance can bridge that gap. So we need the carbon finance. And where's it going to come from? It's from the corporate sector. The corporates who need to be responsible for their greenhouse gas emissions and can do that by investing in carbon reduction and removal projects. It doesn't solve the problem long term, but it does solve a big part of the problem in the short term.
And how does it solve the short-term problem of integrity and people trusting this?
Well, that's being dealt by the initiatives I mentioned earlier. The Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, my organization, sets rules, a guidance for how companies should incorporate the use of carbon credits in their broader net zero transition strategies, how they decarbonize. So it's clear that use of carbon credits needs to complement, not substitute, for internal decarbonization. And that provides integrity so that the public can see companies aren't just using carbon credits for greenwashing claims. They have a product that seems carbon neutral while the rest of their business is emitting fossil fuel emissions. They're using carbon credits to go above and beyond, show real leadership. And companies that make carbon integrity claims from the VCMI will have that comfort that as a result of our work being the process of involving 50 governments, stakeholders from all walks of life, all regions, they can be confident that they're not going to be impugned in public, but they're going to be championed for the leadership they're showing.
So I'm curious first just how you think the work that's been accomplished so far helps. We've just been talking about the practical aspect of it, but I'm just wondering about perception and consumers. And first I just want to ask what you think has been accomplished so far at this COP helps for consumer protection, for consumer understanding of this.
So I think the fact that many governments are recognizing and saying publicly, both from the global south, but also from the global north. My government, the UK government, announced yesterday that it would recommend and endorse the work of the Integrity Council, which sets quality up for the supply side, what kind of credits you should buy, and the work of VCMI, which is the integrity on the demand side. So the fact that governments endorse and recommend, that gives confidence. Governments from the global south are saying clearly that this helps them meet their sustainable development goals. So that gives confidence. We're seeing the CFTC in the US, we're seeing requirements for financial disclosures across the world requiring companies to demonstrate or say how they're using carbon credits. That gives confidence. We're also seeing companies shying away from making spurious claims about certain products or services. They have to do the job at the corporate level and then can champion their achievements using a claim or a label. And that means that consumers know that if you're buying from company X that has made this claim, it's backed up by high integrity frameworks, it's supported by governments, they have to disclose on this publicly with potential sanctions for not doing it right. That means we as customers, the public in general, should have confidence in it.
Right, so now you're sort of foreseeing a future where it's the labeling actually works, in other words.
Absolutely, and it'll take time. But even in that short term, the confidence that having high integrity frameworks brings means that those, maybe not your average consumer, but those who are influencing, those who are putting policy into place, those who are marketing can say, oh, this is the right way to do it. Here is the language we can use that doesn't pretend we're doing one thing while we're doing another, but says, in a way, says what it does on the tin.
Right, so I imagine your hope is, because I think from a consumer or sort of from people who aren't following this very closely, if they do know about it, things they hear are, they think about greenwashing, or they think, how do I know I can trust this?
And they're right to be concerned about that. I think one thing we need to have a bit of humility. There have been mistakes in the past, but there have also been changes in technology, changes in knowledge, which means some of the actions that are in the past, which may have been taken in good faith, are no longer fit for purpose now. And that's why we have these new frameworks that, A, bring all that fragmented part of the market together. We're seeing a lot of work from financial institutions on the financial integrity part of it, so that people act in good faith and are forced to act in good faith. So I think we're making progress there, and we're all working from on the premise that, as with any market, they only scale when people trust them. If you think about any financial market, trust is the fundamental underpinning. So we say, build integrity on the supply and the demand. That builds the trust, and that over time will build scale.
Do you think in a way that the fact that this is apart from a government process, does that make it harder or easier for people to trust this?
It depends which government you have, but
Fair question. Fair point.
I think overall, this needs to move towards regulation, and that will give.
So that would be your preference, that this was regulated by.
And a lot of the work we're doing is specifically to pave the way to regulation. We work, as I said, with representatives of 50 governments in developing our guidance, and we do that in consultation with them to make sure it's fit for purpose for what they want to do, but also to encourage them to put in place regulation, advertising standards regulation, consumer protection regulation, financial disclosures regulation, all the things that we as the public need to be confident in the claims that are being made and the companies that are making the claims. So this is not forever. This is paving the way to regulation. It's helping accelerate regulation and create a single, well-converged system that people can trust in.
So you mentioned briefly the CFTC. Can you tell us a little bit more about that movement and sort of how that helps everything here as well?
So over the last few years, we've seen a huge rise in requirements that companies disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, the risks associated with those emissions, the risks associated with policies to address those emissions, and more detail on how companies are addressing their liabilities, their climate liabilities. And part of that is to report how companies are using carbon credits, not pretending carbon credits are the same as internal reductions, but reporting them clearly, where the projects come, what projects they come from, how they're being used, how they're contributing to certain countries' climate targets. So we're getting much more transparency. And I mentioned before, integrity and trust and transparency is absolutely key to that. And having regulation that requires companies to disclose, so all companies are disclosing in the same way. Investors, regulators can compare and contrast companies, see those who are really leading, those who need a bit more of a push, and those who are really laggards. That helps us not only have confidence in the system, but it also helps us know where we need to push more, where we need more policy.
Can you talk us through what you're thinking in terms of what we can expect in terms of time frame, in terms of, and now that we have implementation, like what we are thinking about time frame and next steps?
Well, as I mentioned, the main standard setters in this space, we came together yesterday to say we're going to work together. There are technical issues we need to work through, how to monitor and measure companies' progress towards their targets, and another range of more arcane issues, but we're committed to working those together. The market had a mini boom, the voluntary carbon market had a mini boom about 2 or 3 years ago. It's flatlined and maybe declined since. But we can see from the pipeline of projects, from the pipeline of companies who are waiting for that moment where they can re-enter the market with confidence, that I expect that to start growing. And I would think in a year's time, wherever we are for COP29, we will see less green hushing, companies doing things but being scared to talk about it, to companies being proud to say, I've done this and I've done it well. And here are a bunch of environmental organizations and a bunch of governments who say, I'm doing the right thing. And it'll be a trickle to start with, but once we start going, then I'm sure it'll grow very quickly because the need is there, the need is urgent, and there are lots of companies who want to show their leadership because it's a marketing opportunity, it helps attract the best employees. Why wouldn't you want to do it? Unless, of course, there's a risk your reputation will be damaged. And that's where we are, helping companies who are doing the right thing be championed for it.
So you've been doing this work for some time. Can you sort of put in context the developments that have happened over the past few days, like how you're feeling about everything?
I was tried to be stubbornly optimistic before I came here, but I wasn't convinced. This has been a market I've worked in for nearly 25 years. And it's had its very mini booms and quite large busts. But I think we're now laying the foundations for something that is far more sustainable in terms of growth over time. The last few days, I mentioned the standard setters coming together yesterday at an event that VCMI moderated with the COP presidency, with the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Prevention on Climate Change, with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, kind of big players in this space, all saying we need voluntary carbon markets as part of a broader package of financing action. We need them now. So that gives confidence, and more governments saying, yes, we need this. It has to be on the right terms. It mustn't be a substitute for other action, but recognize that without this, we're not going to keep 1.5 alive.
So I feel like as journalists, we often get criticized for focusing too much on the negative. In fact, someone told me that today. So I'm going to ask if you would just end by asking if you think, as we think about all the headlines that are going to be coming out and people are going to be talking about things that we're missing, would you fair to say that this is a win?
I think it's the beginning of a win. We've qualified for the Olympics. We haven't won the medal yet,
okay,
but we have to qualify first, and we're being supported by people from almost every sector of society, indigenous peoples, local community, global south governments, global north governments, an increasing number of non-government organizations, and importantly, because they're going to be investing in this, corporates. So we've got the foundations, and we've got the foundations right. We need to push over the next year, and as I say, come back in a year's time, and I hope I'll be telling you even more success stories.
That sounds like great. We will do that. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank Mark Hember, Executive Director of VCMI. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Welcoming back to the stage, Andrew Friedman.
I like that the voice of God intro of Nyla was so conspicuous because she was just walking and not speaking just now. So we might have recorded that in advance. So I'm back. I'm Andrew, Senior Climate Reporter at Axios, and I'd like to welcome our next guest, which is Citi's Chief Sustainability Officer, Val Smith. You're welcome for giving you the shady seat. Citigroup released a report late last week that outlines a framework for the development of bankable projects in the climate finance world. Can you talk us through why that is important and what success might look like?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, talking about bankable projects depends on where you are in the world. And when we think about transition finance and climate finance, we're thinking about transactions and advisories that we've conducted in countries like the United States or Canada. We're thinking about projects that we've conducted or helped with in different emerging markets. And one of the themes that we're trying to carry through at this COP is around how private finance institutions like Citi can better work with development finance institutions to increase the number of bankable projects and to actually, effectuate them and bring them forward. I'll just give you one example of, something pretty innovative that we've been able to do with the World Bank around emissions reductions. So helps to underwrite a $50 million bond for the World Bank that was focused on distributing water purifiers through Department of Education in Vietnam. And the water purifiers actually are helping to purify water instead of burning biomass. That exercise actually generates carbon credits that help to fund the project. So that's an example of the innovation, but I think what we need to do in the development space is really take that to scale.
What sets your approach to sustainability and climate change apart from other players in the banking sector, given the reputational challenges that this sector has over funding oil and gas?
So I've been at Citi for 19 years, focused in the sustainability space, and I was not the first one. I think when you think about Citi's global footprint, and I'll answer your question directly, but when you think about our global footprint and you think about the risks and opportunity associated with sustainability and climate change, you want private finance institutions in this space helping to scale activities. So this is my 5th COP. This is, I think, a different COP in the sense of opportunity. And if you look at institutions like Citi, 95 countries on the ground, 160 countries where we can do finance, this space started, yes, around smaller levels of ambition, around trying to make sure that we were, signaling our interest in financing in this area to clients, but also it started with a focus on risk. And since our net zero commitment in 2021, which is focused on our financing, we have really very quickly moved from a space of ambition to a focus on underpinning all of this net zero work in climate risk, physical risk, transition risk, credit risk, to now, this is why you have all the headlines, including ones that you've written about how many folks from the private finance sector are showing up, because there is a tremendous sense of opportunity, and I think you're seeing that stimulated by regulation around the world, and you're seeing that stimulated by the private market. And so that's really, I think, what drives our excitement here, and I think that that has the potential to really drive emissions reduction.
And you said this is really a different kind of COP when you look at the 5 you've been to, and I'm sorry that you've been to 5.
Yeah.
As a reporter who's covered that many COPs, I commiserate. But I'm usually there till the very end with 3 all-nighters in a row of negotiations, so it's slightly different. What sets this apart to you? I'll give a suggestion and you can tell me if I'm completely wrong. Okay. This feels to me like the Davosification of a COP. Right, you have 9 million events, including this one, with policymakers and private sector talking, and it seems like there's a shift into more focus on implementation and scaling up than there used to be, what the center of gravity used to be kind of in the negotiating room. That's potentially a very good thing, but I wonder if that rings true with you at all, or what your impression is on this particular COP that sets it apart?
Yeah, it probably depends on where you're sitting at COP. I would imagine that the negotiators who are hard at work are feeling very much like this is an important negotiation underway. I think the difference here, yes, you have like a lot of the private sector actors here, more than ever before, they say. Yes, Citi has a larger delegation here than ever before. How I think this is different is that my first COP was in Paris, COP28. Then it was about the private sector showing up to support the negotiations. Then it became about the private sector showing up to, sort of show support for climate ambition. Now you have the private sector showing up to stimulate business. And if we want climate finance to scale, then you have to have it be about, sort of that capitalistic angle. It's about risk, it's about opportunity, it's underpinned by very solid commitments, and I can talk about our net zero commitments, here or later. There's a lot of analysis and math behind it, but fundamentally, this is where our clients are. And this is, I believe, where the relationships around low carbon and transition finance are being formed so that we can stimulate those markets.
And what are the biggest challenges that banks such as Citi face when trying to support clients who are themselves seeking to decarbonize their business models?
Well, I think the big challenge is that we have to move a lot more quickly in the economy than we had before, and we know that there's a tremendous amount of urgency. So I would say a couple of years ago, the market for climate finance didn't feel as promising as it feels today. Are we reaching a tipping point where we start to really see this scale? I think we'll know, you don't know until you're past the tipping point whether you've hit that. But we're going through an exercise under our net zero commitment where we're analyzing and understanding where our clients are in their transition. That helps us to understand where we need to sort of lean in and help our clients to support their transition and where they're already there. But when you look at the types of opportunities already coming out, helping energy clients acquire hydrogen hubs, helping hydrogen clients, issue their public offerings. There is so much happening in this space, in the energy space, in the transport space, and starting to see more in the development area space that I think we are now seeing sort of the commercial opportunities start to scale, and I think it's been supported by market dynamics, but also by the policy space.
And you may have somewhat answered this already, but where are you seeing the most progress in terms of helping your clients decarbonize? Is it going into new energy ventures, like you mentioned, in terms of hydrogen clients? Or is it other types of solutions that you're able to offer clients that you weren't able to before?
It's really across all of the sectors. And I would say in terms of the solutions, to a great extent, financial products are financial products, whether they have a label or whether it's just a transaction. So it could be an advisory transaction for hydrogen, like I mentioned, which is executed by energy experts as well as by hydrogen experts. I think, I mentioned earlier, we're understanding where our clients are in the transition and understanding their plans. And where we've seen, I think, a ton of early successes is on the demand side, and specifically, I'm thinking about the transportation side. So if you think about the transportation side of the equation, it is responsible for a significant amount of emissions, about a third, just under a third. And it's also a sector that we see as being pretty well developed in its transition. Over the past year or two, we've helped to underwrite a green bond for GM directly tied to their electric vehicle ambitions. We helped to lead the public offering for Porsche directly tied to its need to raise capital for its electric vehicle ambitions. And so you're starting to see some pretty interesting transactions, whether they're labeled or not, that are sending pretty clear signals in the transport space. So that's an area that we're watching, but we're also seeing it across the whole energy value chain.
And when you're doing the math on calculating how your sustainability goals are progressing to your net zero plan, which I want to hear a little bit more on that. How much does the bank's funding, as most major banks still are, funding of oil and gas complicate those efforts, or are they accounted for on that balance sheet when you're looking at your net zero commitments?
Yeah, so let me explain two commitments and how that factors in. So first of all, we have a $1 trillion sustainable finance goal. That includes our accounting of activities that meet some pretty rigorous environmental and social criteria, and it's across a range of different products. And so that's the first goal, sort of set up clearly in the opportunity space. Second commitment, our net zero commitment, is focused on our most carbon-intensive loan portfolios. So we've gone sector by sector, 6 sectors so far, started with energy and power, then went to autos, commercial real estate, steel, thermal coal mining. For each sector, we're saying, okay, let us understand where the client's transition is today, what their ambitions are, what their opportunity is. And what I didn't expect when we started this, we were thinking about net zero as a commitment and ambition, a risk-focused area. And I didn't fully expect that these areas of opportunity and risk would start to intersect. And with regard to the energy sector, I would say for the energy system to transition, you need the energy sector. And that is a broad definition of the energy sector. And we see clients, traditional energy clients, new energy clients like the hydrogen one I mentioned, they are all developing technologies in this space, acquiring technologies in this space to help us to scale up, our ability to meet energy needs today and tomorrow through low carbon.
So the net zero commitment is over your entire loan portfolio, correct? and you have focused
Over the
on
carbon-intensive parts of our loan portfolio.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel like continued funding of any of these fuels is a reputational, I wouldn't say necessarily risk, but a reputational challenge that as chief sustainability, person at this company that you have to overcome when you're talking to different audiences?
This is a hard time because we're in this transition space. And let me explain exactly what we've done, because I realize I neglected to speak to a point of your question. So for each client, for each loan portfolio, set of loans to a client, we can calculate the finance emissions associated with our total exposure to the client. We actually publish a whole series of metrics based on our total committed exposure to a portfolio, and that starts at the client and subsidiary level. We also publish metrics associated with the drawn exposure, which is just a fraction of the total committed. So for each client, we have a series of metrics that we can understand around carbon intensity, around our financed emissions. We've rolled those up at the portfolio level. We publish those metrics, and we've set for each sector a 1.5 degree aligned emissions reduction target starting with 2030. It's a 2050 net zero commitment. And so that process helps us to understand where our clients are today. It helps us to understand, again, where those opportunities are for supporting our clients in that transition. But it gives us, a sense not just of our client strategy, but of the numbers associated with it. And so as long as you have conducted that math with transparency, using the best available data, using a 1.5 degree aligned pathway, I think that is a really interesting mechanism for us of both leaning in on the transition, and that's where I think it gets challenging because we're at this middle point where it's hard to show from a quantitative perspective how that transition is happening, mostly because we're using two-year-old climate data. That's just sort of the fact of the matter in the sector. I would say watch this space second half of this decade, where you're going to we believe, start to see real results in the broader market, in the emissions, and certainly in the disclosures that we're putting out there.
Thank you. One last question, since you've been to 5 COPs. What is one piece of advice you'd offer to the audience who is in the process of surviving this COP?
Other than to come equipped with a really good map, because that's been my problem, is that I don't have a great map, and so you're wandering around. One piece of advice, I think what I've tried to do is you try to strike a balance between this kind of exercise where you're sharing what you know and what happens after this, where I catch up with people that I know. And there are so many emerging themes. I haven't heard them all touched on yet around, we've talked about development and the role of development finance institutions. What are we going to see at the end of that? Really interested to see how the methane commitments start to take root. And I think one thing I'm surprised not to have seen or heard about is a little bit more on the intersection of climate and nature and biodiversity, where I think there could be really important co-benefits as we try to tackle multiple crises, but ultimately focus on driving down emissions.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you for joining us at Axios House. Thank you to our sponsor, NextEra Energy Resources, and thank you for coming.